Thanks for the reminder, Dan.
All right, welcome everybody. As Anastasia said, I'm Dan Schwarz. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Metaculus. And today we're going to be talking about corporate prediction markets and forecasting in corporations in general based on my experience at Google. Okay, this is a 45-minute session. Roughly the first half to 2/3 is going to be me talking, and then we're going to have a Q&A and discuss everything that is going on in the corporate forecasting world. Okay, so for those of you who are familiar with the history of prediction markets, it's an idea that's been talked about for a long time, but really got momentum in the early 1990s based on evidence from the Iowa electronic markets, which was forecasting political outcomes. People studying those markets found that markets were doing two things in particular that made them interesting from a forecasting perspective. One is that they had this wisdom of the crowds mechanism in which people's uncorrelated errors were being averaged out when you put their predictions together. And it had an expert discovery mechanism, as in people who were good at it would continue to use it more and more, and people who were bad at it would exit the market, leading to a more and more expert crowd over time. And a lot of organizations noticed this. There were forecasting tournaments that were styled sometimes exactly as prediction markets, sometimes in a very similar way to a prediction market at Intel, at HP, at Nokia, at Ford. Ford was not just sales forecasting. Ford was also forecasting things like the price of oil in 12 months, making up for commodities futures markets that didn't exist at the time. But generally speaking, these were fairly limited. These were taking existing forecasting domains inside organizations and then using a prediction market mechanism to improve their accuracy. And it was only in the early 2000s where a broader approach was attempted. And this was largely spearheaded by Google. In 2005, Google created an internal prediction market called Profit. That pun apparently has been subsequently used by other people in the forecasting space. It was built in part by Hal Varian, who was then and is still today Google's chief economist, and Patrick Friedman. Some of you may know him from other things in the libertarian space, and Bo Cowgill, who is today a professor of economics at Columbia University, a mentor of mine, and I think the leading academic on prediction markets in the corporate environment. This was 2005. This is the early days of Google. This was, back before the YouTube acquisition, before Chrome, if you can remember those times. But still, Google had thousands of employees. And over the time that the prediction market ran, from 2005 to 2008, something like 1 in 4 employees made at least one trade in the market. Virtually everybody that I spoke to in my research who worked at Google during this time was at least aware of Profit, including management. And there were a couple of things about this prediction market that were really unusual. First was the large sample size. The prediction markets at Ford and Intel, HP, there was one at Microsoft Research, there were a few others, were generally quite small. They would have dozens or maybe low numbers of hundreds of traders, and they would focus on a very small number of questions. Sometimes it's as few as 5 or 10 questions, maybe one question about a sales target per quarter, and that was it. Google's prediction market in 2005 had a much broader scope. There were hundreds of questions on topics from, is there going to be a Google Russia office opening, to how many Gmail users will we add this quarter, to all sorts of topics related to the business. It had many, many thousands of predictors. Well, not many, many thousands, a small single-digit number of thousands of predictors, something like 2,500 out of a 7,500 person company. And they studied it and published the accuracy data. And for me personally, I think this is the main innovation, was taking this data and trying to figure out what we could learn. Bo Cowgill in particular published a wonderful paper in 2009 that has this graph. I won't spend too much time talking about calibration charts and forecast accuracy. I think some of you in this audience are already familiar with these style of charts. The basic question is, are prediction markets accurately predicting the future? And one way that you can do that is you can take the price of the contracts. And again, I'm assuming you have a familiarity with how prediction markets work. I'm just going to assume that and go over this very briefly. If you have a price of contracts that is going from 0 to 1, if your prediction market is well calibrated, if that price is 0.5, and that indicates a 50% probability that that thing will actually happen for a binary question. So you could say a market is perfectly calibrated if that were exactly the case. In this graph here, that black line would be that perfect calibration, and the blue line is the calibration that Google's prediction market actually had. So there's a lot of details in here, and we can get into this in the Q&A afterwards, but generally speaking, if Google's prediction market said something had a 70% chance of happening, it actually tended to happen about 70% of the time. And these are, again, are very, very difficult questions being forecasted that are not generally things that organizations normally forecast, like revenue and sales. And this got picked up by the New York Times. This is the other thing about Google's prediction market, is that it went public. Part of this is because the idea of running a prediction market at Google was predicated on the idea that this might be one of Google's next big bets. As those of you who follow Google know, at this time, Google was launching all sorts of exciting products. Google had this mission to organize the world's information to make it universally accessible and useful. Information about the future, as filtered through a prediction market, could plausibly meet this standard for what Google likes to launch. But for various reasons, this kind of stalled out in 2008, 2009. There's some details there, but some of this is confidential internal to Google, so I can't go into much detail about this. But suffice to say, the prediction market was wound down over 2008, 2009, and 2010. So we entered this kind of period without a major corporate prediction market running for a little bit. But in 2015, Bo Cowgill went and summarized what he learned at Google, and along with 2 other examples of prediction markets that were quite large. In his paper, the third organization here, Firm X, didn't want to share who it was. I believe this is public knowledge now, but I'm not going to say. But anyway, these 3 prediction markets were chosen because they had quite a large sample size, which means that economists could study them and see how they were tracking information flowing through the company, what they were accurate about, and how they were useful to the business. So I'll just read this quote to you in full. Despite the popularity of prediction markets among economists, businesses, and policymakers, despite the popularity of prediction markets, economists, businesses, and policymakers have been slow to adopt them in decision-making. We examined data from prediction markets run by Google, Ford Motor Company, and an anonymous basic materials conglomerate, Firm X. Despite theoretically adverse conditions, we find these markets are relatively efficient and improve upon the forecasts of experts at all 3 firms by as much as a 25% reduction in mean squared error. The most notable inefficiency is an optimism bias in the markets at Google, which I thought was quite funny. We could talk about that more later. The inefficiencies that do exist generally become smaller over time. More experienced traders and those with higher past performance trade against the identified inefficiencies, suggesting that the market's efficiency improved because traders gain experience and less skilled traders exit the market. And again, it's important to underline how it's easy to assume that prediction markets are going to produce accurate predictions purely by the basic incentive mechanism, in the same sense that we expect financial markets to do accurate price discovery on commodities, on currencies, on equities and bonds. But prediction markets, because of their very general nature and the broad set of topics that they discuss, and the kind of different ways that they are used in different contexts, public ones, sports ones, politics ones that says corporations, I think it's important to actually look at the data and see, are the mechanisms that prediction markets are supposed to use actually working? So it's quite comforting to see that in a corporate sense, these things were actually working quite well. So back to Google. So profit wound down around 2009. I believe the last market was hosted in early 2010. And we entered this period where forecasting itself was a very big deal within Google, but not via prediction market. There's 3 main areas that Google was investing a lot of resources into forecasting, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who understands how these businesses work. First is revenue forecasting. Second is forecasting the performance of advertisements for customers, which if you go on, Google Ads right now and you say, hey, I'm this business, I want to put advertisements for bicycles with these keywords in these areas, Google can predict how well that will work for you and help you decide whether you want to spend that money. And lastly, data center CapEx and OpEx forecasting, which I was personally involved in 2020 and 2021. This is the task of trying to figure out what computers need to go in which data centers at which time to be used by which parts of the business. This is, I think, very typical supply chain management, and I think forecasting is a huge part of supply chain management at basically every large company that has a large supply chain. But the critical thing is that all of the, not all, but almost all of the innovation into forecasting in these areas was done statistically. There are very clever numerical models, and then of course in the last, since about 2015, 2016, a lot of machine learning and doing this type of forecasting. So the main thing that was missing was the human element. And I think this was felt very strongly in all 3 of these areas when the pandemic hit in 2020. And then this big supply chain crunch, all of the boats off the port of Long Beach that couldn't deliver their parts, the chip shortages that were felt everywhere. The statistical models, unsurprisingly, had difficulty predicting these things, but humans were much more on top of it. And so there was much more of a desire for this kind of human in the loop forecasting. And while I don't think that's actually the most important thing prediction markets do, it is one of the most important things that most people who would put in demand for prediction markets want. How can I have humans augment these forecasting systems that I already have? So there were a couple of things that made it a very good time for me personally to invest in building a new prediction market for Google. First was that Google was much, much larger than it had been in the previous one. I think this still remains to be studied well, but there's no question that there is some positive relationship between accuracy and liquidity in markets. And so having more participants is definitely a good idea. Also, the fact that it was larger meant that the information sources were more diverse. There's just a lot of information at Google, and synthesizing it became a more and more pressing problem over time. One thing that Hal Varian told me when I asked him about how profit ran in the early days of Google was that even when it had thousands of employees, senior management, Larry and Sergey and Eric, kind of just walking up and down the hallways, had a pretty good sense of what was going on. They could just pop in and say, hey, how's this Android thing going, and kind of learn what they needed to know. If something was going behind or there's something going on with the competitor, this kind of information was just very much filtering through the organization in conventional ways. But as Google got very large, this became absolutely impossible to do. The second thing is that the science of forecasting got a lot better. This 2015 paper by Bo Cowgill was very influential to me, but also super forecasting, and I believe in 2017 from Tetlock, obviously changed a lot of people's minds on the value of the human part of forecasting. Third was that Google had this wonderful culture of 20% time, which many of you may have heard of, which empowers individual employees to build things at 20% of their working time for the company if they see an opportunity, and I did. And lastly, and this is a little bit more subtle, there was a demand for better sources of expertise. You can imagine you have a question about, should Google Cloud launch this new type of database? Or what kinds of technology should Google use in a new AR, VR headset it may be developing? Google was so gigantic that it was very difficult to figure out who actually had expertise on these questions. So there are various mechanisms within the company to figure this stuff out, but prediction markets for a narrow type of expertise, which is ability to forecast, are a ridiculously good way of figuring that out very quickly. And also they're very objective in the sense that you could be a new hire in the Philippines office who's only worked at the company for 3 months and right out of college, and you have as much of a chance of influencing that our prediction market accuracy and demonstrating a type of expertise as a senior executive at the company. And there was a lot of demand for that too. Okay, so I started working on this in 2019. It launched in 2020. We went public about it in December 2021. Some of you may remember this Astral Codex 10 article. I picked it up and discussed some of what we were able to talk about publicly on the blog. The product was called Gleangen, which for those of you who work or have worked at Google, you might understand where that comes from. Glean simply meaning as a way of extracting information from various sources. On the left here, you can see a screenshot of what it looked like. This was a market that was forecasting interest rate hikes, which then turned out to, a lot of those happened. That turned out to be a fairly big deal. The market had a pretty simple interface. It was very much built, starting as a 20% project with, get an MVP out the door, do a lot of user research, iterate really quickly. The UI improved rapidly over time. And the first thing that I figured out was that the demand for employees for a prediction market was really, really high. And that gave me the sense that this was really something worth doing. So here's an example of a very, very liquid market. Unfortunately, for confidentiality reasons, I can't say what this was actually forecasting, but it gives you a sense of how a very tight bid-ask spread, incorporating the views of over 1,000 traders making many thousands of predictions, can evolve over time. And again, for internal talks about this, I was discussing what the decision points were that led to the very sharp changes in the probabilities. But generally speaking, you can get a sense of how you could look at one of these markets on a very complicated, important question, watch the bid-ask spread move around in real time and get some really useful information out of it in a way where the sample size is large enough that you think you could maybe trust it. This is the calibration chart here, just like the one Bo Cowgill shared in his 2009 paper. When I've checked this more recently since December 2021, when we shared this, I think the calibration chart has improved a lot. But generally speaking, you get the idea that prediction markets are not oracles. They're not crystal balls, but they are generally mapping prices to probabilities pretty well. And the main thing about Gleangen that made me happy about this is that the sample size we reached was even dramatically larger than profit. We had over 300,000 predictions from over 15,000 people across over 2,000 markets. And I think it's still growing rapidly. This sample size gives you dramatically more confidence in what's going on than the smaller ones that Calgil had studied. And the fact that the accuracy, at least qualitatively, seemed to go up with the more liquid markets over time as experts got more and more expert was very encouraging. That said, we haven't done what Calgil did with Profit and published a paper indicating what we've learned about this and kind of taking some of the open questions from his paper and carrying them forward. So I want to quickly summarize here. I'll spend a little bit of time on the slide talking about my impressions of what went well and what went badly. Again, this is, I guess I will jump to the bottom right thing here in challenges. This is an internal corporate prediction market. By definition, that means that what the Google employees are forecasting is confidential. And even the way that it is helping Google's business is confidential. This is the internal workings of a for-profit corporation. So I'm speaking only in very broad terms, in the ways that I've been authorized to. And recapitulating some information that came in the blog post that we shared in December of 2021, and that was picked up by Hacker News and Scott Alexander. So the first thing, the demand internally for the product was really high. And when I've studied, there was a wonderful EA forum post that was kind of breaking down corporate prediction markets, what went well and what went poorly, and whether they recommended using prediction markets in your corporation. And one of their biggest concerns was low liquidity. You'll see on the challenges, there was some low liquidity in some places that was an issue. But generally speaking, I felt like there was an enormous demand, both for the information, for things about how the pandemic was going to unfold in some of the most exciting parts of Google's business and company and corporate culture and products. But there also was a lot of demand for people to forecast it themselves. I think still, the activation energy to become a predictor is pretty difficult. Forecasting is very hard. If we've learned anything from Tetlock, it takes a lot of practice, a lot of trial and error. But the number of people who are willing to do that and play that game for a long time, do the long feedback loops, make lots of predictions, get lots of profit and loss, learn from their mistakes, move on, try again, was very, very high. And the number of people who wanted to consume that information was higher yet. So the core thesis of there are information flow problems within a corporation that a prediction market can solve, I feel like to me was decisively proven to be true. But that said, I'm kind of jumping around the slide a little bit. The one on the top right, the mechanism for using this information in the business, I think, is still unclear. I'm still waiting for someone to publish a very good playbook on how it is you can take forecasts about, say, what's going on with your company's competitors, what's going on with your supply chain, what's going on with your internal culture, what's going on with your engineering timelines, what's going on with your technology choices, and turning that into some sort of clear decision framework for senior executives who have to take that information into account. I think it was a pretty common mechanism for the information to be interesting to look at and useful for individual employees who are trying to figure out what's going on at the company and what to do with their careers. But if you're deciding what to do with some high-profile launch of some new product or product line, it's difficult to simply take these predictions, even if you completely trust them and use them. And that was one thing that was very surprising to me. Generally, the users of the prediction market would get stuck on how do I incorporate this information, not do I trust this information. I felt in building it and iterating on it, for me, the product was accuracy. That's what I was after from the very beginning. Can we predict these things accurately? And most customers seem to kind of take that as a given. They're like, oh yeah, prediction markets of course work. Oh, that's a nice calibration chart you have there. And they would immediately go right to, okay, how do I use this? Whereas I expected if people trusted the accuracy of the markets, they would just start using it right away. Okay, next on what went well. I think one thing I've learned about prediction markets is that the UI is really important and the execution on making it a good product is really important. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be the new CTO of Metaculus. To some extent, forecasting is such a difficult thing to wrap your mind around that simply putting a couple sliders on a page and saying, hey, figure this out and go forecast is just not going to cut it. I think the idea that you could rapidly iterate from an interface with just a kind of putting all the challenge on the individual predictor and making a tool that makes it easy and natural for you to forecast, gives you good feedback, gives you information from what's going on with the rest of the questions, the rest of the markets, can dramatically improve the experience. I gave UX interviews to dozens of people asking them, hey, what do you think this is doing? How do you think about these forecasts? And I learned a lot about certainly the types of people who naturally get it. Plenty of Google employees took one look at it and immediately understood the core concept. There's a bit of a plane in the background here, apologize for that. But plenty of Google employees looked at it and had no idea how to incorporate probabilistic reasoning into the UI that I had given. I gave UX interviews where people would say strange things like, I think there's a 100% chance that this will happen. How come your UI is not letting me have a 100% probability that this is going to happen? And I would say, really, 100%? Like, there's no world in which this doesn't happen. And they would say, absolutely. I would say, so you'd be willing to bet your house against my $1 that this is going to happen? And then they would stop. And they would say, well, wait, let me think about this more. I think right now, most UIs for prediction markets forecasting interfaces kind of assume that that level of probabilistic reasoning is something that the user already has, and I don't think that's generally the case. But there's also many more simple things, such as notifying predictors when prices change, when trades are executed, when markets resolve, giving them feedback, helping them understand where their profit and loss come from. Some of the work we were doing that was most exciting and was making the most difference to users before I left was helping people understand their portfolio. Okay, I've made all of these predictions on all of these markets. How do they relate to each other? Where is my biggest risk? I think we kind of think about markets or Metaculus questions as individual tasks. Like, your goal is simply to be as accurate as you can or as profitable as you can on this one question. But I think in general, the incentive systems are giving you the sense that you want to do better across a large number of questions, and how they relate to each other, I think, is a big, big unsolved problem in this space. One more thing I'll say about that is I think that there's some kind of debate going on among people in the forecasting space between prediction markets and forecasting platforms. Metaculus is not a prediction market, as I'm sure most of you know already. Prediction markets are a very, very elegant way of generating accurate forecasts. They were very attractive to me because it was something that I personally, in my spare time, could build in just a few months to a year, and then rapidly iterate to make a better and better product. Over time, though, I became less and less convinced that prediction markets are actually the optimal way of aggregating forecasts into a clear perspective. So I'm still looking into this. I still have a lot of things to learn about this, but I kind of went from a prediction market zealot, a true believer in prediction markets as the way of synthesizing information and incentivizing people to reveal their accurate private information, to looking at prediction markets as just one method among many for doing this. If I were to do this again in another corporate setting, I think I would spend time thinking about prediction markets and other alternative, just general forecast aggregation platforms. There also were, for some of you in this talk, I think, there was a small but very vocal minority of users of Gleangen within Google who desperately wished that it was just Metaculus within Google. They didn't want a prediction market. They wanted a forecasting platform, and I found that quite interesting. One other thing I'll say that went well was the adoption of the tool. Google employees from all over the world, like truly all over the world, especially during the pandemic, stepped up to contribute. It wasn't just people making predictions. It wasn't just people proposing questions. We had a phenomenal admin team that I think just did an incredibly good job of moderating the questions, which is, those of you who are in this business know, is one of the absolute hardest things about running a forecasting platform. But also adoption from management in terms of headcount and dollars in order to take this the distance. I feel like that is encouraging to me. As messy as corporate politics can be, the demand for this type of thing is strong enough that I think there's potential probably at many corporations to do this. I think I would say any corporation that probably has more than 10,000 people, I would expect that a prediction market would go very well internally. Maybe not all of them. It depends what your business is. Google had so many fascinating questions that we had so much uncertainty about and so much expertise around the company that we wanted to leverage. I think if you're smaller than 10,000 people, given that you probably will only get maybe 10% of your company to be active traders in the market or active participants in a forecast aggregation platform, if you're down to 1,000 or fewer people, it's less clear to me that that's going to be enough of a sample size where the aggregation is going to do real work. And in particular, if there are domains that you're interested in forecasting where the number of people who understand that domain can be counted on one hand, I don't think you should use a prediction market or a forecasting platform. You should probably just go talk to those people. But for large organizations, I think there's an enormous untapped value, and the demand for it was extremely high. Last thing I'll say, I really jumped around this slide. It's the middle one on the right. Low liquidity on markets most useful to the business. This is a problem that I definitely struggled with for the entire time of running Gleangen. If you had a market on a question that was very interesting to the Google population in general, such as when is my office going to reopen in there? When are they going to ask me to come back to work there? That was a massive, massive topic for Gleangen over the pandemic. you will get all sorts of people with opinions, long comment threads, long discussions, tons of liquidity, tight bid-ask spreads, like things react to news very quickly. If you ask some sort of question about, say something about self-driving cars, the answer to those questions might be very useful, but the number of people who feel incentivized to research and figure out how those things work can be quite small. So in that sense, I feel like it requires stronger and stronger incentives, and Google has experimented with incentives in various forms, but I can't speak in much detail about what those are. I do think those incentives can solve this problem, but it was a little bit frustrating to me that the things that I was most interested in seeing an accurate forecast and the tight bid-ask spread were often the things that had very low liquidity. And we had a lot of internal discussions about running automated market makers. I think most prediction markets have them, and there's I think a pretty wide design space of how you can inject liquidity into markets using automated market makers. This is something I think we were just exploring when I left for Metaculus. Okay, and with that, we will spend the last 15 minutes doing Q&A. So at this point,
I'll just share that.
Take a look at our chat.
Yeah. Because we have so many people on this call, let's actually, if you have a question, use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Google Meet. Or drop it in the chat.
Once we do get hands, Anastasia, you want to call on people for me?
Will do. Do you want me to cold call on people until we get hands? Kunal.
Hi, Dan. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. Could you elaborate a bit more on the difference between a prediction market and a forecasting platform?
Yeah, I feel like someone should write a book on this topic. I would describe it in the most general way that for me, what is interesting about prediction markets is their ability to synthesize information that people privately hold that is different from each other. But if you think about that in the most general sense, the question is, people have different types of information. Those information can be expressed as predictions. Those predictions can be probabilities. They can be distributions. People really have entire, causal models in their head of how things work. And your goal is to aggregate them. If you use a prediction market, the answer to that question is you have people bet against each other to the amount that they disagree. And that gives you an output that can be determined, they could be looked at as an efficient horizon in the sense that the current price that you see on the market is something that no one is willing to trade with at the current moment. And I think that's a brilliant idea. But if you just think about the question of what is the right function that takes in everybody's views and outputs the most accurate possible prediction, I think it would be quite surprising if that one was the one that gave you the most accurate output. And at Metaculus, we have this opinion that there are certain mathematical things that you can do that can get you an accurate consensus forecast. And I think I mentioned this already, but I think the main reason that you might want to use a prediction market is because it's easy. Prediction markets are very easy to build because you're kind of deferring the task of figuring out what the consensus is to the participants in the form of their desire to bet with each other. So for example, sports markets, if you want to see what the line is on a particular game, I think the desire for people to bet is so high and the liquidity is so high that prediction markets are perhaps the best possible way to get the right probabilities that the team will win a game in that context. Generally speaking, though, I don't think it's optimal.
Let's go to Megan. Oops, sorry, Kunal. Did you have a follow-up to that?
Oh, no, I was just thanking him for answering.
To me.
Megan, yeah.
Yeah, hi Dan, thanks so much. This is fascinating. I work in the nonprofit education space, and we are really thinking hard about teaching students forecasting skills, particularly in high school. And I haven't really ever heard about the variation between prediction markets and forecasting platforms. We've sort of defaulted to forecasting platforms, so you might have just sort of made our day to suggest that prediction platforms might be an easier build. I wonder if in all the work that you've done, if you had one suggestion about where we would start, or what do you think is of paramount importance from either a platform perspective for kids or this idea of corralling like-minded or different ideas into one space? Like what advice might you have for us there?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Megan. For children, or really novice forecasters in general, I feel like the forecast training is paramount. And a prediction market can kind of serve as a forecasting arena, especially if it is using play money. It's very low weight to go and try out your hand on this, make some bets, and you get some feedback in the form of profit and loss very quickly. And you can kind of think about it as a game. And I think any child can understand that as a game, and as a game that you can try to get better and better at. So I think that's kind of a way of bootstrapping the process. But ultimately, a forecast platform is only as valuable as the insights that are going into it. At Google, there was this overwhelmingly clear sense that Google employees are very smart and had a lot of information that was not being incorporated by the business. And that was the primary desire. That was the problem I was trying to solve. And that's how Bo Cowgill thought about it too. It's information flows. That information is already there. If you're a small nonprofit, you're working with children, it's not obvious to me that there is that kind of insight already out there that you need to be aggregating. I would start maybe with the problem of generating the insight in the first place. And that is a kind of a forecast training question. Metaculus has a nice tutorial. There's some great information on the web about how to learn to forecast, but I would absolutely start there. I would even say I was maybe hitting the point at Google of diminishing returns, where the people who were naturally good forecasters and already had a bunch of private information that we wanted to get out to help us all. We had kind of gone about as far as you could with that, and then to the frontier of having the much larger group, the 10 times larger group of Google employees who did not know how to forecast or think probabilistically. So I think in your context, the training part might be the most interesting part. And I do think, as Tetlock and many others have said, that forecasting is a wonderful skill to cultivate. It is generally useful. It crosses many domains. It is qualitative and quantitative. It's useful almost everywhere. I think I would focus on the forecast training and then try to figure out what's the best platform to make that fun and engaging and exciting for kids.
Super helpful. Thank you so much, Dan.
In the same sort of general topic area, I don't know if Joseph Sweeney is working with Megan, but he had a question in the chat that is, if you were designing a competition for students, high school students, to help them learn probabilistic thinking, what lessons learned from your experience would you highlight, Dan? Specifically around learning probabilistic thinking.
Yeah, well, there's one thing in particular that I've become kind of a single issue voter on in terms of forecast platforms, which is that things should resolve quickly. There were so many questions proposed. Gleangen was kind of a crowdsourced generation of the markets themselves, as in people proposed the questions. Google is such a large company that we had questions on so many domains that me and my small team of 9 admins could never hope to create all the markets on their behalf. So people had this general ability to kind of come up with all of these interesting things, but they were so often about the far future. People wanted to know things about, is Waymo's, Google self-driving car unit going to IPO by 2030 or some sort of question like this, just as a hypothetical example. And to me, that's not a great place to learn to forecast, because it takes a ridiculously long time to figure out if you were right or wrong. And when you do that post-mortem later and you say, what was I right or wrong about? It's very difficult to say over all of that period of time what you should have been paying more attention to or what you got right or wrong. So for anybody who's learning to forecast, I am a very strong advocate of very short turnaround times, like the beginner tournament that we just launched on Metaculus. Find something that is going to resolve within days or weeks at the most. Do the best job you can at predicting that. Get your feedback quickly. Then when it's still in your memory of what you did and how you came to the probabilities and distributions you had, then look and say, how could I have done this better? And then try again and again and again and iterate.
Thanks, Dan. I'll share that Dan and I were forecasting yesterday how long it would take us to get through customs lines. So sometimes forecasts can resolve ideally in hours even.
Yeah, I did that one very well. I was looking at how many lanes there were, how long it was taking to process each person, and then trying to estimate how many people were in the line. And I got very, very close to the answer, but I almost didn't trust myself because the line looked so long. So I doubled my estimate, but my original estimate was almost exactly right.
Jean-Luc asked, was there any evidence that prediction or betting behavior affected the resolution of the question for internally facing questions? And no worries if you can't disclose that.
Well, what I can't do is give specific examples of this. Unfortunately, I can't talk about any of the individual markets, but I can definitely say that insider trading is the term that people would often use for prediction markets, but also just general forms of market manipulation were constantly discussed and almost never detected. And I think part of this is that the incentives were fairly mild. You could win small amounts of prizes in various ways. I can't go into much detail about exactly how the incentives worked, but I think that they were small enough. And even in theory, if you could imagine, so Profit was doing something back in 2005, I think it was around 2007, they started doing this, paying about $10,000 in Amazon gift cards to the top predictors each quarter. That's a lot of money, and that's worth doing whatever you can to win. But compared to people's salaries, it was kind of low. And so there was no sense that people would try to do something different with their jobs. If you're saying predicting how many users Gmail would get, to introduce a bug in Gmail, make that market lower so that you can win a tiny amount of money. It was absolutely never, even hypothetically, in the interest of anybody to do this. That said, because there was no practical conflict of interest, I didn't make much progress in understanding the theoretical conflict of interest. Obviously, there are certain mechanisms you can have in place about rules about manipulating markets and detecting these things. There are certain groups of people you could say to include or exclude from certain markets, and we had started to do this. But generally speaking, I don't really have a good answer to this question because it's very hard to think about how this might actually ever happen.
Let's jump to Nicholas.
Yeah, so I saw on your screenshot that traders were allowed to set a confidence for their prediction. Could you say something about that and how that was computed then and so on?
Yeah, actually, that's just mostly a misleading term. That was basically how many shares of bids and asks you wanted to buy or sell, and that's it. The original interface actually was just text boxes. That's how you bootstrap something. Just type in your bid price, your ask price, and the number of contracts you want to trade. And then over time, we made better and better UIs for that type of thing. But that's all those sliders were doing. It really is a pure options trading market. It is implemented exactly as people are buying and selling contracts that have conditional value based on something happening at some period of time. So the implementation of it is the same as any options trading market you would see in any sort of financial sense. Yeah, I kind of glossed over that in this talk. I kind of assume if people want to understand how prediction markets actually work, you can find that elsewhere.
Saul was curious, what would or does an automated market maker look like in a prediction market?
Yeah, this one as well. I'll give a 30-second answer to this, but I encourage you to just Google it. There's many great articles on this. There's some really good academic papers. I think Robin Hanson is still the leading theorist on how to use automated market makers to get certain properties in your prediction market. But basically speaking, they provide liquidity. And what liquidity means in a prediction market is that there's always someone to take the other side of your trade. One problem in prediction markets is you might want to have a say, hey, I would take 3-to-1 odds on this question, but if you can't find someone to take the other side of that, you don't get a bet, and that means you don't get a profit or loss, and you don't get feedback. This is like the classic problem of markets in general, and prediction markets especially, and automated market makers are a way of addressing this liquidity problem by putting basically a bot at the other side of your trade at certain prices under certain conditions. There's many ways of doing it. It's a super fascinating area. I was just starting to explore this. So Google automated market maker, and maybe Google Robin Hanson too, and you'll find some good papers.
Well, we've got, I think, time for a couple more questions. But Harrison asked if you could sort of talk about the claim that prediction markets might upset the hierarchy of management versus employees.
Yeah, this is another one that for the years that I worked on this was often discussed, and I don't think I ever actually came across an actual instance of this. But I think the way that senior management thought about decision making, I think implicitly took into account the sense of who is the expert that I trust. And that was a big question that a prediction market has to solve. Is it's a source of information among many. Let's say you're trying to decide whether you want to, launch a new mobile, Gmail product or something like that. There's so many things you have to consider, and it's such a big, complicated problem that if you're a, senior vice president or a CEO of a large corporation, you're going to authorize your lieutenants, your product managers, your team, your reports to go and do a bunch of research and try to figure out if this is a good idea or not, of what they expect to happen under various scenarios and things like that. How long it would take, how much it would cost, how many users you expect to get in the first month, like the role of it strategically. A prediction market can help you forecast specific inputs to that, and you may or may not trust it as much as your lieutenants. But there's kind of this issue of, if a prediction market can answer those questions, then why do you need the senior vice president getting paid the big bucks in order to do this research themselves? So I think there's this theoretical sense that by democratizing the flow of information within a corporation, you're kind of upsetting the power balance. But again, I never once actually saw this. I never saw a case where a senior person looking to use a market would say something like, well, but this isn't my team coming to this conclusion, therefore I don't trust this. Maybe this is a kind of a Google thing, but Google executives, I think, are very responsive to data. If you provide them data, they're happy to take that data into account. And again, forecasts don't determine decisions. A forecast is just one of many sources of information to go into a larger strategy of making your decisions. So there's no real sense that democratizing just the forecasting side was like much of a threat to your overall decision-making process. But that said, if someone wanted to implement, again, speaking for of Robin Hansen's ideas, the idea of a decision market where decisions are actually determined by conditional forecasts in prediction markets, I would say then you'd have a bunch of trouble, where you're kind of taking the decision-making authority away from the executive and democratizing it, and you might run into some problems. But in a conventional way of just use a prediction market to forecast, just use that forecast to make a better decision, I never saw a conflict.
Cool. I'm going to take, Ciro just had a final great question that I thought would be a great one to end on, which is that forecasting in general can be a bit hard to get into, and you touched on this, Dan. So according to your experience, how do you think forecasting could be perceived as something more attractive to a wider open public and increase engagements on platforms like Metaculus?
I think there's two things in particular, and this is not new at all. I think probably everybody in this talk and in this space has thought about these things before. The first is that forecasting is a skill, and it's something that you can train, and it's fun in the same way that you could learn a language, or you can learn to play chess on the internet, or you can learn, a musical instrument. It's a thing that you can do that is very, very rewarding when you get good at it, but it's very, very difficult in the sense that it's very difficult to just pick up a guitar and start playing and suddenly become a good guitar player. You need a lot of infrastructure, you need a lot of support. But if you have this perspective of, I want to be a person who can play the guitar, that's something that is worth a lot to me and I'm willing to try hard, I think that can get you along your journey of forecasting. And I mentioned that, it sounds very obvious, but I don't think a lot of people do think of forecasting as a skill. So getting that mindset around it is it's a skill that you can acquire and it's a useful thing to have in your life and it's worth working hard for, I think is the first thing. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of other things about forecasting in particular, like the way that it's quantified, the way that you have to think numerically, the way you research things, the way you get feedback, but I'm sure it wouldn't be that new to the group. But I think that what I learned from having many, many thousands of people within Google basically forecast for the very first time is giving them that sense of like, this is something attainable. This is something that you can do. This is something that you shouldn't expect to be immediately good at, but if you do this thing, you can get better and better at it. And then you can kind of join this, basically elite squad of Google forecasters who are weighing in on all of these interesting questions. And that's something that's worth working hard for.
And when you're going to see it, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dan, for sharing your experience. We hope that this was all informative to you all. We will be posting the link to the recording on a discussion post on Metaculus. And we hope to see you all later this week for other talks. Tomorrow we have Mike Famulare from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who does infectious disease modeling, talking about modeling of the COVID-19 pandemic with forecasting. So hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.